Welcome, listeners, to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we journey into a town wrapped in fog and secrets. Settle in as we begin our story, The Conspiracy of the Silent Crows. Chapter 1, The Feather on the Page. The first thing you notice about Havenwood, Oregon, is the quiet. It's a profound, almost unnatural stillness, broken only by the distant cry of a raven or the whisper of wind through the towering Douglas firs that wall the town in. I came here to escape the noise. Chicago was a symphony of chaos, sirens, arguments, the constant, grinding hum of a city that never slept. After 12 years of chasing ambulances and political scandals as an investigative journalist, my nerves were shot. Havenwood was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where the biggest news story was the annual bake sale or a black bear rummaging through someone's trash. For 6 months, it was exactly that. My life slowed to the rhythm of the seasons, my days measured in cups of coffee at the daily grind and long, aimless walks in the woods. I was Ethan Hayes, former journalist, now a professional recluse in training. I was learning to appreciate the silence. But on a cold Tuesday morning in October, I learned that some silences are far from peaceful. Some silences are heavy with things left unsaid, with secrets buried just beneath the surface. My morning routine was sacred. Wake up, brew coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and sit on my porch overlooking the mist-shrouded valley. But that day, the routine was shattered by the frantic ring of my landline phone, a relic I kept mostly for nostalgic reasons. On the other end was Sarah Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who served as the town's unofficial gossip columnist. Her voice, usually warm and chirpy, was tight with alarm. "Ethan, have you heard? It's Alistair Finch. Something's happened at the town archive." Alistair Finch. The name felt out of place with the word happened. Alistair was Havenwood's gentle, unassuming historian. He was a man made of tweed jackets, dusty books, and endless stories about the town's founding families. He practically lived in the archive, a small, stone building attached to the public library, safeguarding the town's collective memory. He was as much a fixture of Havenwood as the old clock tower in the town square. "What happened, Sarah?" I asked, my old journalistic instincts twitching, a ghost limb I thought had long gone numb. "They won't say much," she whispered, her voice crackling over the line. "Sheriff Brody's there. They've taped off the whole area. They're saying he just passed away in his sleep at his desk." "But Ethan, that doesn't feel right." "Not Alistair." She was right. It didn't feel right. Alistair was meticulous, a man of routine and measure. Falling asleep at his desk and never waking up seemed too mundane, too simple for a man who saw complex histories in every cobblestone and carving in town. Against my better judgment, I told Sarah I'd check it out. The part of me that had moved to Havenwood for peace groaned in protest, but the reporter in me was already grabbing his coat. The town square was abuzz with a nervous energy I hadn't seen before. People were gathered in small, hushed groups, their faces etched with confusion and concern. The yellow police tape stretched across the entrance to the archive was a jarring slash of color against the gray, overcast sky. I saw Sheriff Brody standing near the door, a big man whose weary expression suggested he'd much rather be dealing with a runaway lawnmower. I'd known Brody for a few months. We had a grudging respect for one another. He saw me as a nosy city slicker, and I saw him as a small-town cop who was probably more competent than he let on. "Morning, Sheriff," I said, approaching him slowly. "Heard about Alistair. A real shock." Brody grunted, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Hayes. Figured I'd see you here. Can't keep a bloodhound away from the scent, can you?" "Just paying my respects," I lied smoothly. "Everyone loved Alistair. Any idea what happened?" "The talk is a heart attack." Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "That's what the doc is leaning towards. Looks peaceful. Like he just drifted off while reading. We're waiting for the county coroner to make it official. Nothing to see here." He was trying to dismiss me, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, something that didn't align with his nothing to see here statement. My reporter's sixth sense was tingling. "Mind if I take a quick look?" For old time's sake. Alistair was helping me research a local history piece. Another lie, but a plausible one. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Fine. 2 minutes. Don't touch anything. The scene is processed, but I don't want you messing with the coroner's workflow." I stepped under the tape and into the archive. The air inside was thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and something else, the faint metallic scent of finality. Alistair Finch was slumped forward in his heavy oak chair, his head resting on a large open book on his desk. He looked exactly as Brody had described, peaceful, an old man who had simply run out of time while surrounded by the things he loved. but my eyes were drawn to a single, jarring detail. There, resting delicately on the center of the open page, was a single, perfect black feather. It was glossy, immaculate, and utterly out of place. It wasn't from a dusty feather pen. It was a crow's feather. "What's with the feather, Brody?" I asked, keeping my voice low. The sheriff came to stand beside me, his gaze fixed on the object. "I don't know." Window was cracked open. Bird probably flew in and out. It's a weird detail, nothing more. But it wasn't just a weird detail. It felt intentional. Placed. The window was barely open an inch, not nearly enough for a crow to get in and out. And the feather wasn't just lying there. It was positioned with an almost ceremonial precision, right over a paragraph detailing the town's founding in the early 1800s. I leaned in closer, trying to read the text without disturbing the feather. The page was about the 5 founding families of Havenwood, the Blackwoods, the Harpers, the Prestons, and 2 others whose names were obscured by Alistair's hand. A crow just happens to fly in, drop a single feather on the exact subject he's reading, and fly out? Seems like a stretch, I murmured, more to myself than to him. "Look, Hayes," Brody said, his patience wearing thin. "I've got a dead old man who likely had a bad heart, and a town full of people who are going to be asking questions I don't have answers to. I don't have time for conspiracy theories about birds. It's a feather. That's it. Now, your 2 minutes are up." I knew pushing him further would get me thrown out. I gave a slow nod and backed away, but not before discreetly taking out my phone and snapping a quick, high-resolution photo of the desk, the book, and the feather. As I stepped back out into the crisp autumn air, the hushed whispers of the townspeople seemed to take on a new, more sinister tone. The silence of Havenwood no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a lid on a pot that was about to boil over. Alistair Finch hadn't just died. He had been reading about the town's origins, and someone or something had left a calling card. A single, silent black feather. A message. And I was the only one who seemed to think it mattered. My quiet life in Havenwood was officially over. The hunt for a story had just begun, and I had a chilling feeling that this story was one the town would do anything to keep buried. Walking away from the town archive, I felt a familiar, cold knot tightening in my stomach. It was the same feeling I used to get in Chicago right before a big story broke, a mix of adrenaline, dread, and an insatiable need to know more. Sheriff Brody could call it a feather, a freak occurrence, a meaningless detail, but I knew what it was. It was a statement. A period at the end of a sentence that only Alistair Finch had been able to read. The rest of us were just looking at the ink. The people in the town square watched me as I walked past, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and suspicion. In Havenwood, an outsider was always an outsider, and my interest in their local tragedy would not go unnoticed. I needed a place to think, a place where I could be anonymous, or as anonymous as one could be in a town of 2,000 people. I headed for the daily grind. The coffee shop was the town's central nervous system. If you wanted to know the pulse of Havenwood, you went there and listened. The bell above the door chimed, announcing my arrival. The low hum of conversation immediately dipped, and several pairs of eyes flickered towards me before quickly looking away. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon, and speculation. I spotted Sarah Jenkins in her usual corner booth, a half-empty mug of tea in her hands. She waved me over, her expression anxious. "Ethan, you were in there," she said in a hushed, conspiratorial tone as I sat down. "What did you see? Is it true what they're saying? That he just passed?" I ordered a black coffee from the young barista, who looked like she'd been crying, and then turned my attention back to Sarah. "It looks that way," I said carefully, knowing her words would be all over town in an hour. "He looked peaceful, like he fell asleep." I omitted the part about the feather. For now, that was my own secret. Sarah slumped back in her seat, though she didn't look relieved. "I suppose that's a comfort. But still, Alistair was researching something. He told me so himself last week. He said he'd found something in the old town charters, something. Unsettling was the word he used. He was excited, but nervous. My senses sharpened. Unsettling how? Did he say what it was about? No, she sighed, shaking her head. Alistair was always so cryptic when he was on the verge of a discovery. He just smiled that little secret smile of his and said, "The roots of this town run deeper and darker than anyone knows, Sarah." That was the last thing he ever said to me. Just then, the bell on the door chimed again. A chill seemed to pass through the coffee shop, and the remaining chatter died down completely. A tall, elegant woman in her late 60s stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a tailored wool coat that probably cost more than my car. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and her face, though lined with age, was set in a mask of stern authority. This was Eleanor Blackwood, the matriarch of the Blackwood family, the closest thing Havenwood had to royalty. Her family had owned the local timber mill, the bank, and half the land in the county for over a century. They were one of the founding families Alastair had been reading about. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze swept across the room with an air of ownership, finally landing on me and Sarah. Her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, lingered on me for a fraction of a second too long. There was no warmth in them, only assessment. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible nod to the owner behind the counter, she turned and left as silently as she had arrived. The collective breath of the room was released. "She gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered, taking a shaky sip of her tea. "The Blackwoods have always acted like they own this place." "They practically do," I said, my mind racing. Eleanor Blackwood's appearance felt like more than a coincidence. It felt like a message, a silent assertion of dominance on a day when the town's history was being brought into question. I finished my coffee, thanked Sarah for the information, and left the oppressive atmosphere of the shop. I needed to be alone. I needed to look at that photograph. Back in the solitude of my small cabin on the edge of the woods, I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and sat down at my desk. The silence here was different from the town's. It was a clean, empty silence that allowed me to think. I opened the image on my laptop and zoomed in. The quality was good. I could clearly see Alastair's hand, the page of the book, and the stark, black feather resting on the text. The book was titled Havenwood's Roots, A Settler's History, written by the town's first official historian back in 1912. The paragraph under the feather was a dry, academic description of the 5 families who had signed the original Havenwood Pact, establishing the township. The Blackwoods, the Harpers, the Prestons, the Garrisons, and the Caldwells. It spoke of their shared vision and mutual cooperation. It was standard, uninteresting historical text. I scanned every detail of the photo. The feather. The words. Alastair's tweed sleeve. Nothing seemed out of place, other than the feather itself. Frustration began to creep in. Was Brody right? Was I, the jaded city reporter, seeing a conspiracy in a simple tragedy? Was I just bored and looking for a puzzle to solve? I was about to close the file when I decided to push the image's contrast and sharpness settings, a trick I used to use to find details in grainy surveillance photos. The pixels shifted, the whites becoming brighter, the blacks deeper. And then I saw it. It was almost invisible, hidden in the slight shadow cast by Alastair's hand. In the margin of the page, right next to the paragraph listing the founding families, was a faint pencil marking. It wasn't a word or a symbol. It was a sequence of 4 numbers, written in Alastair's small, precise script. 4-18-15-23. I stared at the numbers, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. This was the unsettling thing he'd found. It wasn't in the text itself, but a note he had made about it. The feather wasn't the message. The feather was a pointer, drawing the eye to the page, a page where Alastair had left the real clue. What did the numbers mean? A date. April 18th, 1523? That was centuries before Havenwood was founded. A locker combination? A Bible verse? Or was it a cipher? A key to unlocking something he had hidden? A shiver ran down my spine, a cold premonition that had nothing to do with the autumn chill outside. Sarah was right. Alastair Finch hadn't just died. He had discovered a secret tied to the founding families of Havenwood, a secret he tried to pass on in his final moments. And now, that secret was sitting on my laptop screen, disguised as 4 simple numbers. I didn't know what they meant yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to find out. And in a town as quiet as Havenwood, I had a feeling that digging up old secrets was a very dangerous thing to do. The numbers burned in my mind, 4-18-15-23. I spent the rest of the day and a sleepless night staring at them, scrawled on a notepad on my desk. I tried every combination I could think of. I treated it as a simple substitution cipher, where 1 equals A, 2 equals B, and so on. That gave me DROW, drow, a dark elf from fantasy novels. It felt like a ridiculous dead end. I tried converting it to coordinates on a map, but the location it pointed to was an empty stretch of forest miles from town. Nothing made sense. The frustration was a familiar itch, a puzzle with missing pieces. I knew I was looking at the numbers all wrong. They weren't a message in themselves, they were a key. And the lock was back at the archive. The next morning, I learned the coroner's report had been released. Just as Sheriff Brody predicted, Alastair Finch's death was officially ruled a result of a massive coronary event. Natural causes. Case closed. The yellow tape was gone, but a simple sign on the archive door read, "Closed until further notice." The town of Havenwood was ready to mourn its historian and move on. I wasn't. Getting back inside was the problem. I couldn't just walk in. Brody would have my head if he caught me meddling in what was no longer a crime scene. I needed someone on the inside. My thoughts immediately went to the main library. Alistair ran the archive, but it was still technically part of the larger library system. There had to be someone else with a key. At the library, I found a young woman I'd seen a few times before, diligently reshelving books. She was small, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of black-rimmed glasses. Her name tag read, Maya Lin. I remembered Alistair mentioning her once, calling her his brilliant, if overly cautious, protégé. I approached her carefully. "Excuse me, Maya. I'm Ethan Hayes. I was a friend of Alistair's." Her face, already pale with grief, tightened. "I know who you are. The reporter." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Former reporter," I corrected gently. "I'm just trying to make sense of what happened." Alistair was helping me with some research. I think he may have left some of his notes on his desk. With the archive closed, I was hoping. "I can't let you in," she said immediately, shaking her head. Sheriff Brody gave explicit instructions. No one goes in until the town council decides what to do with Mr. Finch's effects. She was stonewalling me, just as I expected. It was time for a different approach. I lowered my voice. "Maya, I was there. I saw him. And I saw something that didn't make sense. I think Alistair found something important, something he was trying to protect." Her eyes flickered with a spark of interest. "What did you see?" I took a gamble and told her. A crow's feather, placed perfectly on the book he was reading. I watched her reaction closely. She didn't dismiss it. Instead, a little shudder went through her. She glanced around the empty library aisle. "The silent crows," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What?" I asked, leaning in. "What are the silent crows?" "It's an old story. A ghost story, really," she said, wringing her hands. "Local folklore. They say that when one of the founding families is about to lose a secret, a crow will deliver a silent warning. It's just a silly legend people tell their kids. Mr. Finch, he loved those old tales. A legend. It was more than that, and I think she knew it too. His death wasn't a warning, Maya. I think it was the secret itself being buried. The numbers 4-18-15-23. Do they mean anything to you?" She stared at me, her eyes wide. She recognized them. It's a catalog number," she breathed. "It's part of the deep archive system Mr. Finch designed. The things that are too old or fragile for the main collection. It means Section 4, Row 18, Box 15, Item 23. My heart leaped. This was it. I need to see what's in that box, Maya. He left that clue for a reason. If you respected him, you have to help me see what he thought was so important it cost him his life." She was torn. I could see the battle in her eyes between her cautious nature and her loyalty to her mentor's memory. Finally, with a deep, shaky breath, she gave a single sharp nod. "Tonight, after the library closes. Meet me at the back entrance at 10. The hours crawled by. At 10 o'clock sharp, I was standing in the dark alley behind the library. The door creaked open and Maya slipped out, pulling me quickly inside. "We have to be fast," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The sheriff has a deputy do a drive by every couple of hours." She led me through the silent, tomb-like library and into the archive. The room was cold and still. The desk where Alistair had died was now hauntingly empty. Maya didn't hesitate. She led me past the main shelves to a heavy steel door at the back. She unlocked it, revealing a staircase leading down into a cool, dry basement. This was the deep archive. Rows upon rows of metal shelves stretched into the gloom, filled with gray, acid-free storage boxes. Maya navigated them with an expert's familiarity. Section 4, 17, 18. She ran her finger along the shelf. Box 15. She pulled down a dusty medium-sized box and placed it on a nearby table. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, there wasn't a book or a bundle of documents. Instead, there was a neat row of small 5-inch reel-to-reel audio tapes, each labeled with a date from the late 1950s. I carefully lifted the last one from the bottom, the one that would be the 23rd item. It was unlabeled. Blank. Audio tapes. I said, confused. From the 50s? Mr. Finch was undertaking a massive preservation project, Meyer explained. Digitizing old oral histories. Interviews with the town's oldest residents from decades ago. Just as she finished speaking, a bright light swept across the high basement window, followed by the sound of a car engine idling in the alleyway. We both froze. The deputy, Maya mouthed, her eyes wide with panic. We ducked behind a tall shelf, my heart pounding in my chest. The car sat there for what felt like an eternity before finally pulling away. The close call had shattered our nerve. We have to go. Now, Maya insisted. I looked at the box of tapes, then at the single, unlabeled reel in my hand. I couldn't take them all. I pocketed the blank one. It was item 23. It had to be the one Alistair was pointing to. I have a friend in Portland who restores old audio equipment, I lied, needing to reassure her. I can get this playing. We need to know what's on it. She nodded, her face pale in the dim light. We quickly replaced the box, erased any sign of our presence, and slipped back out into the cold night. As I walked back to my cabin, the small, cold reel felt impossibly heavy in my pocket. It was a voice from the past, a story someone in Havenwood had told half a century ago. A story Alistair Finch had died to protect. And I was about to hear it. The small tape reel felt like a lead weight in my pocket. It was a physical piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet see, a voice silenced for more than 60 years. My first problem was a practical one. Reel-to-reel players weren't exactly standard equipment in the 21st century. My lie to Maya about a friend in Portland was just that, a lie. Driving 4 hours to the city felt like a waste of time and would attract unwanted attention. No, the answer had to be here, buried in the accumulated history of Havenwood itself. I spent the next morning calling the few antique shops in the surrounding counties, coming up empty. They had plenty of old furniture and vintage clothing, but no functioning audio equipment from that era. Defeated, I ended up at the daily grind, hoping a dose of caffeine would spark an idea. As I nursed my coffee, I overheard a conversation about a broken lawnmower. One of the men, a logger named Dave, mentioned taking it to Old Man Miller's place, because if it's got wires and gears, Jake Miller can fix it. A new name. I asked the barista about him. Her eyes widened slightly. Jake Miller. He's a character, she said. Lives out on the Old Ridge Road. He's a bit of a recluse. Collects all sorts of old junk. Radios, TVs, you name it. Most people stay clear of his property. A reclusive collector of old electronics. It was a long shot, but it was the only one I had. The drive to Jake Miller's house took me out of the quaint town center and onto a winding, unpaved road. His property was less of a home and more of a technological graveyard. Rusted satellite dishes leaned against trees like giant metal mushrooms. Old antennas sprouted from the roof of his dilapidated house, pointing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The place screamed, "Keep out." I parked and cautiously approached the front door, stepping over a tangle of thick cables. Before I could knock, the door creaked open and a man appeared, blocking the entrance. He was thin and wiry, with a wild mane of gray hair and a deeply suspicious look in his pale blue eyes. He held a wrench in his hand like a weapon. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Are you Jacob Miller?" I asked. "I was told you know a thing or two about old audio equipment." "Who told you that?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "You from the county? Trying to find me for the antennas again?" "No, nothing like that," I said, holding my hands up in a placating gesture. "My name is Ethan Hayes. I'm working on a personal project, trying to preserve some old family recordings. They're on a reel-to-reel tape, and I can't find a working player anywhere." He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze searching my face for any hint of deception. "Family recordings, huh?" he grunted, unconvinced. "What family?" I hesitated, then decided a piece of the truth was better than a complete lie. "Alistair Finch's family," I said. "He was a friend. He left this behind, and I think it might be important." The mention of Alistair's name changed something in his expression. The hard suspicion softened into a grudging curiosity. "Finch," he muttered. "He was all right. One of the few in this town who appreciated things that were built to last." He looked at the tape reel I held out. "Let me see it." I handed it over. He examined the tape with an expert's eye, turning it over in his calloused hands. 5-inch spool. Acetate base. Late 50s, probably. Standard stuff for its day. He finally looked up at me. "All right. Come on in. But if you touch anything, I'll be using this wrench for more than tightening bolts." I followed him into a house that was more workshop than living space. Every surface was covered with dismantled electronics, schematics, and tools. In the center of the room, on a clean, well-lit workbench, sat a magnificent piece of equipment, a vintage Ampex reel-to-reel recorder, its metal polished and its components clearly maintained with loving care. "She still works like the day she was made," Jake said with a flicker of pride. He carefully threaded the tape through the machine's complex path of rollers and heads. "This is a delicate process. Tape this old can get brittle." With a final, expert adjustment, he flipped a switch. The reels began to turn slowly, silently. Jake adjusted a knob, and a low hiss filled the room. For a moment, that was all there was. Then, through the crackle of 60 years of silence, a voice emerged. It was an old man's voice, laced with the rough, weary accent of someone who had spent their life working the land. "Don't know why you want to hear this stuff, Alistair," the voice said, sounding shaky. "These are old stories. Best left buried." I shot a look at Jake. The tape was an interview. An interview conducted by Alistair Finch himself, probably as a much younger man. "Just tell me what you remember, Samuel," Alistair's younger voice replied, clear and patient. "About the Havenwood pact. The book says it was an agreement for the common good." The old man on the tape let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "The common good. That's what they printed in the history books. It wasn't about the common good. It was about survival and profit. 5 families wanting this valley for themselves. But they weren't the first ones here. There were other folks. Settlers who had the prior claims. The pact wasn't an agreement. It was a conspiracy. My blood ran cold. The man's name was Samuel. Samuel Garrison. One of the founding families." "What do you mean?" young Alistair asked. "There was a fire," Samuel Garrison whispered, his voice dropping so low we had to lean in to hear. "A terrible one. Wiped out the old claim office, and all the records with it. A week later, it wiped out the cabins of the folks who argued the loudest. The Blackwoods, the Prestons, all of them. Their hands weren't clean. They called it a tragedy. We called it a cleansing. They took the land, and the 5 families made a promise. A vow of silence. They said the crows would watch. Not the birds, son. That was their name for the enforcers. The ones who made sure the silence was kept. If anyone talked, the silent crows would pay them a visit. Leave a little black feather as a warning." The tape hissed for a few more seconds, and then the recording ended abruptly. The reels spun in silence. Jake slowly reached out and stopped the machine. The room was deathly quiet. He looked at me, his face ashen. The paranoia I had first seen in his eyes was back, but now it was magnified by genuine fear. "Family recordings," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "You lied to me." "I needed to know what was on it," I said, my own voice unsteady. "You should have left it alone," Jake said, standing up and backing away from the machine. "This isn't just history, son. You heard him. The silent crows. People in this town still believe in them. You're not just digging up stories. You're digging up graves. And some people will do anything to make sure they stay buried." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was 60 years in the making. "Get that tape out of my house. And don't you ever come back here." I walked away from Jake Miller's property with the old man's fearful words echoing in my head. "You're not just digging up stories. You're digging up graves." He was right. The voice of Samuel Garrison had transformed the mystery from a single, questionable death into a foundational crime that implicated the entire town. The silent crows weren't a ghost story. They were a 60-year-old conspiracy, a vow of silence kept by the most powerful people in Havenwood. Alistair Finch hadn't just stumbled upon the secret, he had been killed for it. And now, I was the one holding the shovel. My first instinct was to run. To take the tape, get in my car, and drive back to Chicago, leaking the story to a former colleague and letting the ensuing firestorm burn from a safe distance. But I knew I couldn't. I thought of Alistair, the gentle historian who had been silenced. I thought of the fear in Jake Miller's eyes. This secret had held Havenwood in a grip of fear for generations. Running wouldn't change that. My journalistic training took over, pushing the fear into a manageable corner of my mind. A conspiracy is only as strong as the people who keep it. I needed to know who I was up against. I had the names of the 5 founding families: Blackwood, Preston, Harper, Caldwell, and Garrison. I needed to know who their descendants were today. I called Maya. My voice was low and urgent. "Meet me at the library. Back entrance. I know what Alistair found." When I played her the recording of Samuel Garrison's confession, a quick digital copy I'd made with my phone, the color drained from her face. She held a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning understanding. The folklore she had grown up with, the spooky stories told around campfires, had just materialized into a horrifying truth. "The fire at the old claim office," she whispered. "It's in the history books. It was always called the Havenwood tragedy. They said it was an accident, a stray lantern. According to Samuel Garrison, it was arson. A cover-up," I said. "And the families have been enforcing a vow of silence ever since. We need to find out everything we can about the descendants. Who are they now? Who has the power?" For the next several hours, Maya and I transformed a quiet corner of the library into an investigative hub. She was brilliant, navigating the town's digital archives and physical records with an efficiency that would have made Alistair proud. We dug through property deeds, business licenses, birth certificates, and decades of back issues of the Havenwood Chronicle on microfilm. A picture began to form, a modern-day map of the old conspiracy. The Blackwoods were exactly as I'd suspected, at the absolute pinnacle of the town's hierarchy. Eleanor Blackwood was the public face, the revered matriarch, but her son, Thomas Blackwood, wielded the real power. As CEO of Blackwood Industries, he was the largest employer in the county. His influence extended into every corner of local politics and commerce. They weren't just a founding family, they were the ruling family. The Prestons and the Harpers were their loyal lieutenants. The Prestons owned the largest construction company in the region, which, we noted, received nearly every major municipal contract. The Harpers ran the town's most influential law firm, representing the Blackwoods and Prestons in all their affairs. The families were tightly interwoven, their children intermarried, their fortunes linked. They formed a triumvirate of power, an impenetrable wall around Havenwood secrets. Next, I had Maya search for the Caldwells. The result was chilling. The direct family line had ended abruptly in 1974. The last male heir, a man named George Caldwell, had died in a supposed hunting accident. His wife and daughter had moved away a year later, selling their ancestral land to Blackwood Industries for a fraction of its value. Another convenient tragedy. Finally, we looked for the Garrisons. Samuel's family. The family of the whistleblower. The records told a sad, predictable story. In the years following the date of the tape, the Garrison family's small farming business had failed under mysterious circumstances. A series of blights, loan denials from the Blackwood-owned bank, and zoning disputes had bled them dry. Like the Caldwells, their land had been sold to the Blackwoods. But unlike the Caldwells, the family line hadn't vanished. A single descendant remained. Owen Garrison, Maya said, her finger tracing a line on a public record printout. He's Samuel's great-grandson. Lives on the old logging road on the west side of town. Keeps to himself. The records say he's a carpenter, a woodworker. Owen Garrison, the last remaining heir of the one family member who was willing to talk. He was either a loose end the other families had allowed to exist, or he was too beaten down to be considered a threat. Either way, he was my next step. He might possess family stories, journals, or just a deep-seated resentment that I could use to pry the conspiracy open. I have to talk to him, I said, a new sense of purpose solidifying in my gut. As Maya gathered our scattered research papers, her body suddenly went rigid. She was staring out the large library window, which looked out onto the darkening street. "Ethan," she said, her voice tight, "don't turn your head too fast." A car just pulled up across the street. It's been there for 5 minutes. I casually glanced at the window's reflection. It was a sleek, black sedan, the kind with tinted windows that are too dark to be legal. It was parked in the shadows, its engine off, just sitting there, watching. It was the type of car Thomas Blackwood would drive. A cold wave washed over me. Our research hadn't gone unnoticed. Jake Miller was right. We weren't just digging up graves. We were disturbing the ghosts that still guarded them. And now, they were watching us. We were no longer on the outside of the conspiracy looking in. We were now a part of it, marked as a threat that would need to be managed. The silence of Havenwood was being broken, and its keepers were starting to listen. The sight of the black sedan sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. It was no longer a theory. We were being watched. My investigation had disturbed something, and now the creature was stirring, its eyes fixing on us in the dark. "Okay, stay calm," I said to Maya, my voice a low whisper. "They don't know that we've seen them. We're just two people working late at the library." "What do we do?" she asked, her knuckles white as she gripped a stack of books. "We separate. There's a side exit that leads to the park. You take that. Walk home like you normally would. I'll go out the back. Give it 10 minutes. Don't look over your shoulder. Just go." She nodded, her face a pale mask of fear, but her eyes were resolute. She trusted me. The weight of that trust felt heavier than any secret. After she slipped out into the night, I counted down the longest 10 minutes of my life. I went out the back alley door, the same way Maya and I had entered the night before. I walked in the opposite direction of my cabin, my hands shoved in my pockets, forcing a casual pace. I looped around the town square, my path deliberately erratic. At the reflection in a darkened storefront window, I saw it. 2 blocks behind me, the same black sedan, its headlights off, was crawling along the street, keeping pace. They were on me. The hunt was on. I spent the next hour leading them on a pointless tour of Havenwood's quiet residential streets before finally ducking through a series of narrow, wooded paths that I knew cars couldn't follow. I made it back to my cabin breathless and soaked in a cold sweat, my paranoia now fully justified. They knew who I was, and they were watching my every move. The next day, I knew I couldn't drive to Owen Garrison's house. They would follow me and put him in immediate danger. I had to approach him on foot, off the beaten path. I put on my hiking boots, grabbed a backpack with water and a map, and drove my car to the trailhead of a popular hiking route on the west side of town. It was the perfect cover. I left my car in the public lot and set off into the woods, just another person enjoying the crisp autumn air. After about a mile, I left the marked trail, using a compass and the map on my phone to cut southwest through the dense forest. An hour of navigating tangled undergrowth and quiet groves of ancient firs later, I emerged at the edge of a clearing. Below me sat a small, well-kept house with a large workshop next to it, a thin plume of wood smoke curling from its chimney. This was Owen Garrison's property. As I approached, I saw a man standing outside the workshop, examining a piece of lumber. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 60s, with a weathered face and the powerful hands of a man who worked with them for a living. His gray hair was tied back in a short ponytail, and his eyes, when they finally lifted and noticed me, were filled with a deep, weary caution. "This is private property," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't hostile, just tired. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime telling people to leave him alone. "Mr. Garrison? Owen Garrison?" I asked, stopping a respectful distance away. "My name is Ethan Hayes. I'm new to town. I was admiring the woodwork at the town hall, and someone told me you were the artist responsible." It was a flimsy excuse, but the best I could come up with. He gave a non-committal grunt. "I do some work for the town now and then." He didn't invite further conversation. "I was hoping to commission a piece," I pressed on. "A custom bookshelf. And also, I'm something of an amateur historian. I'm fascinated by the history of this area. Your family name is one of the originals, isn't it?" His eyes hardened. "There's nothing fascinating about it. We're just people who stayed. If you want a bookshelf, you can leave your number. If you want to talk history, go to the library." He turned to go back into his workshop. He was shutting me down completely. It was now or never. "I listened to your great-grandfather's tape," I said, my voice quiet but clear. Owen froze, his back to me. Every muscle in his body seemed to tense. Slowly, he turned around. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a flash of raw, guarded emotion. It was fear, but underneath it, I saw a flicker of something else. Anger. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Samuel Garrison. I heard his interview with Alistair Finch from the 50s. I know about the pact. I know about the fire. And I know about the silent crows." He stared at me, his jaw working silently. He searched my face, looking for a trick, a threat. Then, with a deep sigh of resignation, as if a burden he'd carried his whole life had finally been acknowledged by an outsider, he nodded toward the house. "You better come inside." His home was simple, clean, and filled with the scent of sawdust and lemon oil. He poured us both coffee in chipped ceramic mugs. For a long time, he just sat there, staring into the black liquid. "My father told me about that tape," he finally said. "He said my grandfather Samuel confessed everything to that historian kid. He regretted it his whole life. Said it put a target on our family's back. After that, nothing ever went right for the Garrisons." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a lifetime of resentment. "The accidents started. Our crops failed. The bank called in loans. The other families bled us dry and bought our land for pennies on the dollar. They wanted to erase us. They almost succeeded. Why didn't your family ever go to the police? Tell someone?" I asked. He let out a short, bitter laugh. Tell who? The sheriff. His last name was Preston. The judge. A Harper. The mayor. A Blackwood. It's still the same today. This town doesn't have leaders. It has owners. They own everything. Alistair was killed because he was digging into this again, I said. They left a feather. Owen nodded slowly. That's their way. It's a promise. A promise of silence. My father found one on our mailbox the day before our last plot of land was foreclosed on. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. They've been looking for something for generations. The one thing my great-grandfather had that they couldn't burn in the fire. He called it the garrison box. He buried it before he died. What's in it? Proof, Owen said. A signed deposition from an eyewitness to the fire. Maybe the original land deed they tried to destroy. I don't know for sure. But it was enough to make Samuel paranoid for the rest of his life. And it's enough to make the Blackwoods and the others nervous, even today. Where is it? I asked, my heart pounding. I don't know, he admitted. Samuel never told his son directly. Too dangerous. He left a clue, a riddle that's been passed down in our family. A way to find it if things ever got bad enough. He looked me straight in the eye. He said, it sleeps where the stone giant dreams under the crow's nest. It was cryptic, a piece of folklore. But it was the next step. Thank you, Owen. I said, standing up to leave. Be careful, Mr. Hayes, he warned. The Blackwoods have been searching for that box for 70 years. Now that they know you're looking, they won't stop. They'll see you as a threat that needs to be managed. I walked down his long gravel driveway, my mind racing to decipher the riddle. The stone giant. The crow's nest. My thoughts were so consumed that I almost missed it. There, stuck neatly into the top of his wooden gatepost, was a single glossy black crow feather. It was freshly placed. It hadn't been there when I arrived. They hadn't just been following me. They were already here. They were watching the last garrison, and they knew I had just found him. The image of that single black feather, a stark, silent threat against the weathered wood of Owen's Gate, was burned into my mind. It was a clear, unambiguous message. We know you were here. We are watching him. We are watching you. The game had escalated. Before, they were observing me, tracking my movements. Now, they were communicating, making their presence known, turning the psychological screws. They were telling me that nowhere in Havenwood was safe. I spent another sleepless night, the riddle echoing in my head. It sleeps where the stone giant dreams under the crow's nest. It was a piece of poetry, a fragment of family folklore that now held the key to everything. I couldn't ask anyone in town about it. In a place this small, a question like that would travel straight to the ears of the Blackwoods or their allies before I even finished the sentence. My only ally was Maya. I met her at the library before it opened, slipping in the back door as she arrived for her shift. I quickly told her about Owen, the garrison box, and the fresh feather. Her face grew paler with each detail, but she didn't flinch. The fear was there, but it was being overshadowed by a fierce resolve. This conspiracy had taken her mentor. She wasn't going to let it win. A stone giant and a crow's nest, she murmured, already moving toward the archive section. These sound like local landmarks, the kinds of names that don't make it onto official state maps. We need to look at old surveys, local folklore collections, maybe even Alistair's personal research notes. For 2 hours, we pored over dusty documents. We found several mentions of Crow's Peak, a prominent summit on the ridge that bordered the northern edge of the valley. That was the easy part. The stone giant was more elusive. We were about to give up when Maya pulled out a long, rolled-up tube from a mislabeled section of the archive. It was a beautifully detailed, hand-drawn topographical map of the county from the 1920s. And there, sketched along the northern ridge, was the answer. The entire ridge, when viewed from the valley, had the distinct silhouette of a massive figure lying on its back. The cartographer had labeled it with its local, unofficial name, the Sleeping Giant. Crow's Peak was the giant's head. The riddle suddenly became crystal clear. The box was buried somewhere on that ridge, just below the summit of Crow's Peak. It sleeps where the stone giant dreams under the crow's nest. Now came the hard part, getting there without my ever-present shadow. I knew the black sedan would be waiting, watching my cabin or my car. I formulated a plan that was equal parts deception and audacity. I drove east out of town, in the opposite direction of the ridge, and parked at the crowded lot of a popular waterfall trail. I made a show of grabbing my hiking pack, locking my car, and heading down the trail. I was sure they were watching from a distance. I followed the trail for half a mile until it curved sharply around a bend, giving me a few precious seconds of cover. I ducked off the path and into the thick woods, just as I had done to get to Owen's property. This time, my trek was far more arduous. I spent the next 3 hours navigating by compass, pushing through dense forest and scrambling up steep, rocky inclines, circling back west toward the sleeping giant ridge. By the time I began my final ascent toward Crow's Peak, my legs were aching and I was covered in scratches, but I was certain I hadn't been followed. The air grew thinner and colder as I climbed. The forest floor was a carpet of pine needles, and the wind whispered through the ancient trees. The place felt remote, timeless, a perfect hiding spot for a dark secret. I reached the area just below the summit, the spot on the map that would be the giant's neck. The riddle was my only guide. I scanned the area, looking for something that stood out. And then I saw it. Standing alone in a small clearing was a massive, gnarled oak tree, far older and larger than any other tree on the slope. Its sprawling branches looked like protective arms. This had to be the place. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached it. At the base of the tree, half hidden by overgrown moss, was a small, unnatural-looking pile of rocks. They were arranged in a way that didn't feel random. I dropped my pack and started pulling the rocks away. Beneath them, the earth was softer. I dug with my bare hands, the cold soil numbing my fingers. After a few minutes of frantic digging, my hands struck something hard and metallic. With a final surge of adrenaline, I pulled it free. It was a heavy steel box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface pitted with rust from decades in the damp earth. The garrison box. I found a rock and hammered at the rusted latch until it finally broke with a groan of protest. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, protected by a decaying oilcloth, was a slim leather-bound journal and a single, yellowed document tied with a faded ribbon. I was reaching for it, my hands trembling with the magnitude of my discovery, when a voice cut through the silence of the forest. "I'll take that, Hayes." I spun around, my blood turning to ice. Standing 10 feet away, partially hidden by the shadow of a pine tree, was Sheriff Brody. He wasn't in his uniform. He was in civilian clothes, but he held his service weapon in his hand, pointed not at me, but casually toward the ground. His face was unreadable, his tired eyes holding a new hard glint I had never seen before. "Fancy meeting you up here, Sheriff," I said, my voice strained, my mind racing. "Save it," he said, stepping forward into the clearing. "I'm not here for a chat. That box contains private family matters. It's not for you, and it's not for anyone else. Hand it over, and you can walk off this mountain and out of this town, and we'll forget any of this ever happened." The offer hung in the cold mountain air. He hadn't come here to arrest me. He had come here to retrieve the evidence. He was one of them. He was a keeper of the silence. I was cornered, miles from anywhere, with the town's chief of police, who was now nothing more than an enforcer for Havenwood's oldest and darkest conspiracy. The world seemed to shrink to the small, cold clearing on the mountainside. There was the ancient oak, the disturbed earth, the open metal box in my hands, and Sheriff Brody, a man I'd shared coffee with, now standing as a gatekeeper to a century-old crime. His gun wasn't aimed at my heart, but it didn't need to be. Its mere presence was a full stop to any thought of escape. "You're a Preston, aren't you?" I asked, stalling for time, my mind frantically cycling through options. There were none. "Your mother's side. I saw it in the town records." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even surprise, crossed his face. "Very thorough, Hayes. I'll give you that. Yes. My mother was a Preston, which means my family has been a part of this town since the beginning. We've kept it safe. We've helped it prosper. That box," he said, nodding toward it, "threatens all of that. It's a relic of a harder time, and its only purpose now is to cause pain." "Alistair Finch is dead because of it," I shot back, my voice steadier than I felt. "That's not pain from the past, Brody. That's happening right now." He had the decency to look away for a moment, his gaze settling on the distant valley below. "Alistair was a friend," he said, his voice low. "He was warned. He was told to leave it be. He got that warning from me, personally, but he was a historian. He couldn't resist digging up old bones. Some bones," he added, his eyes meeting mine again, "should be left buried." This was his confession. He was an active participant. He had delivered the warning, the first, gentle one, before the feather. "So you're offering me the same deal? A warning? It's better than a deal." "It's a guarantee," Brody said, taking a step closer. "You hand me that box, you get in your car, and you leave Havenwood. You forget our private family matters. In return, you get to keep having a future. The alternative." He let the word hang in the air. Well, you saw the Caldwell records. George Caldwell loved to hunt up on this ridge. It's a real tragedy what happened to him. Accidents happen all the time in the woods. The threat was clear, cold, and utterly believable. He would kill me, stage it as an accident, and the entire power structure of Havenwood would back him up. I was completely and utterly outmatched. But a journalist's best weapon isn't his fists, it's the story itself. I took a slow, deliberate breath. Before I came up here, I sent a package to a former colleague of mine at the New York Times, I said, the lie forming on my lips, tasting of desperation and hope. It contains everything. A copy of Samuel Garrison's audio tape, my notes on the 5 families, the suspicious circumstances of the Caldwell deaths, my belief that Alastair Finch's heart attack was no accident. The package is set to be opened in 48 hours, unless he hears from me. If I have a hiking accident up here, Sheriff, you won't be burying a secret. You'll be putting a spotlight on it for the entire world to see. My death becomes the ultimate validation of the story. I watched his face, praying the bluff would land. I hadn't actually sent a package. There hadn't been time. But the logic was sound, and it was the kind of move a seasoned reporter would make. Doubt clouded his eyes. He was a cop, trained to assess threats. He was weighing the odds, the potential fallout. The simple, clean solution of my death had just become messy and complicated. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Are you willing to bet your town's entire existence on that? I countered. Are the Blackwoods? We were at an impasse. He couldn't let me leave with the box, but he couldn't risk killing me. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind. I knew I had a window, a tiny fracture in his resolve, and I had to take it. In one fluid motion, I reached into the box, grabbed the journal and the deed, and shoved them inside my jacket. Then, with all my strength, I hurled the heavy empty steel box as far as I could down the steep, wooded incline. It crashed through the undergrowth, a loud metallic cascade of noise that drew Brody's attention for a single vital second. It was all I needed. I didn't run down the mountain. I ran sideways, scrambling across the rocky face of the ridge, diving into the thickest part of the forest. Haze! I heard him yell behind me, a sound of pure fury. I didn't look back. I crashed through branches that whipped at my face, my lungs burning, my only thought to put as much of the wild, untamed forest between us as possible. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing behind a fallen log, my body screaming in protest. I had the proof. The journal and the deed were still inside my jacket. But I was now a fugitive. I couldn't go back to my cabin. I couldn't get to my car. Brody would have the whole area locked down. He would be hunting me, and he knew the terrain far better than I did. My mind raced, searching for a sanctuary, a place to hide and regroup. I couldn't go to Maya or Owen. They would be the first people Brody would watch. I was alone, isolated, and running out of time. Then, an image surfaced in my mind, a yard full of junk, a paranoid old man with fear in his eyes, and a workshop full of tools and isolation. Jake Miller. He'd thrown me out, told me never to come back. But he knew the truth. He understood the danger. He feared the Blackwoods and their enforcers. He was my only chance. As dusk began to settle over the forest, casting long, menacing shadows, I got to my feet. Bruised, exhausted, and hunted, I oriented myself using the setting sun and began the long, slow trek through the wilderness, not toward the safety of town, but toward the fortified home of Havenwood's most paranoid and reclusive citizen. The forest at night is a different world. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a fresh jolt of fear through my exhausted body. The adrenaline from my escape had worn off, leaving behind a deep, throbbing ache in my muscles and a dozen stinging cuts on my face and arms. I was cold, disoriented, and being hunted. I clutched the precious journal and deed inside my jacket, the stiff paper a constant reminder of what was at stake. They were the only reason I was still pushing forward through the darkness. It took me hours, moving slowly and cautiously, to navigate the treacherous terrain. I saw the distant sweep of headlights a few times, cutting through the trees on the roads below, and I would freeze, my heart pounding, convinced it was Brody's patrol car. The entire law enforcement apparatus of the county was likely looking for a lone hiker who'd had an accident. My disappearance was the official story they would be setting up. Sometime after midnight, I finally stumbled out of the woods and saw the familiar, chaotic silhouette of Jake Miller's property. The antennas on his roof looked like a bizarre metal forest against the starry sky. His house was dark, but a single dim light glowed from the window of his workshop. He was awake. I didn't go to the door. I knew better. A man like Jake would have his property secured. I circled the perimeter, moving slowly, until I found what I was half expecting, a thin tripwire connected to a small bell, hidden in the shadows near his front path. I carefully stepped over it and approached the workshop, my feet making no sound on the soft dirt. I knocked softly on the metal door. "Jake, it's Ethan Hayes." The light inside instantly went out. Silence. I could feel him on the other side, listening, holding his breath. "Jake, I need your help," I whispered urgently to the closed door. "Brody knows. He cornered me on the mountain. I have the proof from the garrison box, but he's hunting me." The silence stretched on. I was about to knock again when the door was wrenched inward. Jake stood there, backlit by the faint moonlight, holding a shotgun. It was pointed right at my chest. His face was a mask of pure, undiluted terror and rage. "Get out of here, Hayes," he hissed. "You've brought a death sentence to my door. I told you not to come back." "I have nowhere else to go," I pleaded, showing him my empty hands. I was too tired to even feel the fear of the gun barrel. They were watching me. They were watching Owen. They're probably watching the library. You're the only one they might not suspect. The only one who is off their grid. "I've survived this long by staying off their grid," he shot back. "You bring the grid right to me. They'll tear this place apart looking for you." He was right. But I had one card left to play. It was the same one I'd used on him before, the truth. "You're already a loose end, Jake. You heard Samuel Garrison's confession. You know the truth. After they're done with me, who do you think they'll come for next? The one other person who listened to that tape. Hiding won't save you. Not this time. The only way we get out of this is by winning. By getting the story out." I saw the flicker of indecision in his eyes. His paranoia was at war with his logic. I reached slowly into my jacket. He tensed, his finger tightening on the trigger. I carefully pulled out the journal and the old deed. "This is it, Jake. The proof. A first-hand account of the fire, written by an eyewitness. The original deed to the land they stole. This is the weapon that can bring them down." He stared at the objects in my hand. His eyes, accustomed to seeing the inner workings of machines, were now looking at the gears of a historical crime. He was a man who respected tangible things, evidence, facts. And here they were. His shotgun lowered an inch. Then another. With a final, agonized groan, he stepped back. "Get inside," he growled, "before you bring the whole damn world down on us." He slammed the door and bolted it behind me. The workshop was an oasis of light and warmth. He pointed to a stool. "Sit." He came back a minute later with a first aid kit and a bottle of whiskey. He wordlessly began cleaning my cuts as I took a long burning swallow from the bottle. For the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of safety. When he was done, I opened the journal. The ink was faded, the handwriting a spidery scrawl, but it was legible. It was the journal of a man named Elias Thorne, one of the original settlers whose cabin was burned. The entry for the night of the fire was chilling. He described being woken by screams, seeing the claim office engulfed in flames. He wrote that he saw two young men on horseback, their faces illuminated by the fire, throwing torches onto the roof of his neighbor's cabin. He named them clearly, Thaddeus Blackwood and Silas Preston, Brody's ancestor. He wrote about how he and his family had fled into the woods with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the deed to their land, which he'd had the foresight to grab. The rest of the journal was a heartbreaking account of a man broken, hiding in fear, afraid to come forward because of the silent crows who patrolled the valley. Next, we examined the deed. It was the original stamped and sealed claim to a 100-acre parcel of land that now sat squarely under the Blackwood timber mill. It was the smoking gun. It was undeniable proof of the crime. We sat in silence, the weight of the evidence filling the small workshop. We had the truth, a truth that could shatter the foundations of Havenwood. "So we have it," I said, finally breaking the silence. "Now what? We can't call anyone. We can't email. Brody will have eyes on everything." Jake stood up and walked over to a corner of his workshop that was covered by a heavy canvas tarp. He pulled it away, revealing a massive, immaculate piece of vintage equipment, a ham radio transmitter, complete with a towering antenna I now realized was the centerpiece of his rooftop collection. "The sheriff might be watching the phones and the internet," Jake said, a grim, determined look on his face I had never seen before. "But this thing talks to the whole world. And it's a language they've long forgotten." The workshop, which hours ago had felt like a trap, now transformed into a command center. Jake Miller, the paranoid recluse, was in his element. The fear was still in his eyes, but it was now overshadowed by a lifetime of pent-up defiance. He moved with a manic energy, his hands flying across panels and switches that hadn't been touched in years. "This is a Collins KWM-2, he said, patting the enormous radio transmitter with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. "Thing of beauty. They don't make them like this anymore. The Blackwoods and their puppets can monitor every email, every cell phone call, but this is like a ghost. It speaks a language they've forgotten." While Jake worked, wrestling with vacuum tubes and calibrating frequencies, my job was to shape the narrative. I sat at a small, cluttered desk, the damning journal open before me, and began to write. I couldn't just read the whole thing. I needed to be concise, powerful, and irrefutable. I was a journalist again, writing the most important story of my life. I structured the broadcast like a lead article, an explosive opening, the key evidence, the names of the guilty, and the connection to the present-day crimes. Every word was a bullet aimed at the heart of the conspiracy. As we worked, a new sense of urgency took hold. "We need to see them coming," Jake muttered. He disappeared into his storeroom and emerged with a tangle of wires and 2 old, black and white security cameras. Within an hour, he had them mounted and running, feeding grainy images to a small monitor on his workbench. One camera was aimed down his long, dark driveway. The other watched the back of the property, where it met the woods. We weren't just hiding anymore. We were fortified. Just as I finished scripting the final words of my broadcast, Jake gave a triumphant grunt. A row of vacuum tubes on the transmitter glowed with a warm, orange light, and a low, powerful hum filled the workshop. "She's alive," he whispered. "I can bounce a signal off the ionosphere and reach half the continent if the weather's right. Found an open frequency. It's an old emergency band. State police and old-school radio nuts still monitor it sometimes. It's our best shot." A flicker of movement on the monitor caught my eye. My blood ran cold. It was a patrol car. Brody. It was moving slowly down the main road, past the turnoff to Jake's driveway. A routine patrol, or the beginning of a systematic search. We didn't know, but the clock was now ticking audibly. "It's time," I said, my voice grim. Jake nodded. He handed me a vintage microphone that was heavy and cool in my hand. "Once you start, don't stop. They might try to jam us. I'll do what I can to keep the signal clean. Just get it all out." I took a deep breath, the smell of ozone and hot electronics filling my lungs. Jake gave me a thumbs up. I began to speak. "To anyone listening, this is an emergency broadcast. My name is Ethan Hayes. I am a journalist, broadcasting from a secure location in Havenwood, Oregon. I am in possession of direct evidence of a conspiracy that has controlled this town for over a century. A conspiracy responsible for multiple deaths, including the recent murder of town historian Alistair Finch." I didn't hesitate. I laid it all out. I read the most damning entry from Elias Thorne's journal, my voice ringing with the dead man's fear and anger. I named Thaddeus Blackwood and Silas Preston as arsonists and thieves. I described the stolen land deed and read its legal description, the very ground the Blackwood mill now stood on. I connected it all to the present, naming Eleanor and Thomas Blackwood as the heads of the conspiracy, and Sheriff David Brody as their enforcer, who attempted to murder me just hours ago. "The proof is real," I said, my voice rising. "The garrison box has been found. The truth of Havenwood's founding is a lie built on ashes and blood." As I spoke, the signal began to crackle and hiss. "Jamming," Jake growled, furiously turning dials. "They found us." I pushed on, speaking faster, trying to get the last, crucial details out. For a terrifying minute, the signal was almost lost in a wave of static. Then, Jake slammed his fist on a console, and my voice boomed clear again. I finished with a final plea, giving the call sign of Jake's radio station. "The evidence is secure. Do not trust the local authorities. I repeat, do not trust the Havenwood Sheriff's Department." I put the microphone down, my entire body trembling. The room was silent except for the hum of the radio. We stared at the speaker, waiting, listening. Did anyone hear? Was it all for nothing? For a full minute, there was only static. My heart sank. Then, a voice cut through the hiss. "This is K7VLX out of Eugene. We copy your broadcast. What is the nature of your emergency?" Before we could respond, another voice, sharp and official. "This is Oregon State Police, Newport Station. We have a partial copy of your transmission. Please verify your location. Are you in immediate danger?" Then another, and another. A trucker on the I-5. A ham operator in Tacoma. A chorus of unseen, unknown listeners. The story was out. It was real. A wave of triumphant relief washed over me. We had done it. The moment of victory was shattered by the image on the security monitor. Headlights. 2 pairs of them, turning off the main road, piercing the darkness of Jake's long driveway. The first vehicle was Brody's cruiser. The second was a large, black SUV. The Blackwoods. They were done trying to be silent. They were coming for us. The moment of triumph was fleeting, instantly replaced by the primal fear of the approaching headlights. The broadcast was out, a signal flare of truth launched into the night, but the consequences were now rolling up the gravel driveway. "Kill the lights," Jake commanded, his voice a low, steady growl. He moved with an incredible, practiced efficiency that belied his age. He wasn't the terrified recluse anymore. He was a fortress commander preparing for a siege. He threw a heavy bar across the steel-plated workshop door and slammed thick metal shutters over the windows, plunging us into a near-total darkness broken only by the glow of the radio tubes and the grainy security monitor. On the small screen, we watched the 2 vehicles come to a stop. Brody got out of his cruiser. From the black SUV, 2 figures emerged. One was a large, imposing man I didn't recognize. A foreman from the mill, perhaps. The other was tall, dressed in a sharp, expensive-looking coat. Even in the grainy black and white image, he moved with an air of absolute authority. Thomas Blackwood. There was no immediate assault. They stood there for a moment in the cold glare of their headlights, an invading force on a hostile shore. Then, a voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cut through the night. It wasn't Brody's tired growl. It was smooth, calm, and laced with venom. "Mr. Miller." "Mr. Hayes," Thomas Blackwood's voice boomed, unervingly reasonable. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You've had your little broadcast. You've made your point. But the state troopers are a good hour away, maybe more if they hit that roadwork on the 101. An hour is a very long time." He paused, letting the threat sink in. A lot can happen in an hour. An old, cluttered workshop like this? Full of chemicals, sawdust, old wiring? It would be a terrible tragedy if a fire were to break out. All that history, up in smoke. The echo of his great-grandfather's crime was so blatant, so arrogant, it was breathtaking. This wasn't just a threat, it was a statement of legacy. "The whole world is listening, Blackwood." I yelled back, my voice muffled by the steel walls. A dry, humorless chuckle came through the bullhorn. "The world is a long way away, Mr. Hayes. We are right here." A sharp, metallic bang echoed as the large man swung a sledgehammer against the workshop door. The sound was immense, but the door held firm. Jake let out a grim smile. "Half-inch steel plate on a reinforced frame," he said, more to himself than to me. "He can swing that hammer till his arms fall off." The thudding continued, a relentless, percussive beat marking the time we had left. Another man, Brody, started working on the window shutters, trying to pry them open with a crowbar, but the heavy bolts Jake had installed years ago refused to budge. They were locked out, but we were locked in. The assault on the door stopped. A new sound began, the revving of a powerful engine. On the monitor, we watched in disbelief as Brody got back into his cruiser, reversed, and then slammed the vehicle forward, using it as a battering ram. The first impact was deafening. The entire workshop shuddered, and tools rattled off the shelves. The door buckled inward, its frame groaning in protest. "He's going to bring the whole wall down." I yelled over the noise. "The frame is bolted to the concrete foundation." Jake yelled back, his eyes glued to the monitor. "But it won't hold forever." Brody reversed for another run. But before he could accelerate, Blackwood stopped him. They were changing tactics. The brute force approach had failed. Now came the fire. We saw them moving around the building, splashing liquid from canisters against the wooden exterior walls. The acrid smell of gasoline began to seep through the ventilation shafts. Jake's face, illuminated by the monitor's glow, was a grim mask. He grabbed 2 fire extinguishers, handing one to me. "This is it," he said, his voice devoid of any panic. "Aim for the base of the flames. We just need to buy time." A road flare arced through the night and hit the side of the workshop. The gasoline ignited with a deafening whoosh. Orange light flickered through the cracks in the shutters, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the room. The monitor showing the outside view was now a swirling chaos of smoke and flames. The heat was almost instantaneous, and the smell of burning wood and chemicals filled the air. Smoke began to pour through the vents. I coughed, my eyes streaming. We sprayed the extinguishers at the hottest spots near the door and windows, but it was like trying to fight the ocean with a bucket. The fire was consuming Jake's life's work, his sanctuary. It was consuming our air. The steel door was now glowing a dull red. The roar of the fire was all-encompassing. Despair began to set in. We had gotten the truth out, but we were going to be cooked alive in this metal box, becoming just another tragic chapter in Havenwood secret history. And then we heard it. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail, almost lost in the crackle of the flames. It grew steadily louder, closer, splitting into multiple distinct voices. Sirens. Not one or two. A whole fleet of them, screaming through the night, getting closer with every passing second. On the monitor, through the smoke, we saw a flash of movement. Blackwood and his man were scrambling back toward their SUV. Brody was already in his cruiser. They were trying to flee. The cavalry had arrived. The roar of the fire was now joined by the roar of approaching engines and the piercing shriek of the sirens. We stumbled back from the heat of the door, coughing, gasping for air, our faces lit by the terrible orange glow of the fire. We looked at each other, two unlikely allies, covered in soot and sweat, and saw the same thing in each other's eyes, a flicker of hope. Through the smoke and flames, we could see the flashing red and blue lights as they flooded the property, bathing the entire chaotic scene in the beautiful, unmistakable colors of rescue. The first breath of clean, cold night air was dizzying. I stumbled out of the workshop's gaping doorway, leaning against the scorched frame, my lungs aching from the smoke. Jake was right behind me, his face a mask of soot, his eyes wide as he surveyed the scene. The world had transformed from a claustrophobic, fiery trap into a chaotic ballet of flashing lights. State police cruisers were parked at every angle, their red and blue strobes cutting sharp, rhythmic patterns through the lingering smoke and the steam rising from the fire hoses. Firefighters were dousing the last of the flames that had consumed the side of the workshop, while uniformed troopers moved with calm efficiency, securing the perimeter and shouting orders. A paramedic was gently trying to guide me toward an ambulance, but I waved him off. The cuts and bruises were nothing. The feeling of survival, of air in my lungs, was everything. A woman in a crisp state police captain's uniform approached us, her expression sharp and unreadable. She was in her 50s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately commanded respect. Her name tag read, Rostova. "You're Ethan Hayes?" she asked, her voice clear and direct, cutting through the surrounding noise. "Yes. This is Jake Miller. My troopers will get a preliminary statement from Mr. Miller," she said, her eyes already assessing the damage to the workshop and the clear signs of a violent assault. "You come with me. You have a lot to explain." I was taken to the back of a command vehicle, a mobile office buzzing with radio chatter. For the next hour, I told her everything. I started with Alistair Finch's death and the single black feather. I detailed the discovery of the tape, the meeting with Owen Garrison, the Garrison box, and the standoff with Sheriff Brody. Finally, I handed her the precious, smoke-tinged evidence, Elias Thorne's journal and the original stolen deed. Captain Rostova examined the items under a bright light, her expression growing more grim with every page she turned. She listened to my story without interruption, her gaze unwavering. There was no disbelief, only a cold, professional anger. "You did the right thing broadcasting," she said when I had finished. "Coming through official local channels would have gotten you killed." A young trooper knocked and entered. "Captain, we've secured 3 suspects." The mill foreman, a man named Carl Hendricks, was apprehended at the bottom of the driveway, and we've taken Sheriff Brody into custody. My head snapped up. "Brody!" "He tried to play it cool," the trooper reported. "Acted like he was the first on the scene, responding to a fire call. But his hands were covered in gasoline, and his cruiser has a sledgehammer and a crowbar in the trunk. He's not talking." "And Thomas Blackwood?" Rostova asked, her voice like ice. The trooper shook his head. "The SUV was found abandoned 2 miles down the highway. Blackwood is gone." The news hit me with a thud. The enforcer was caught, but the architect of the attack was still in the wind. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, gray light on the wreckage of Jake's property, the full weight of the state's investigative power was on display. Forensics teams were combing the area, documenting the assault. I was finally allowed to make a phone call. I dialed Maya's number. She picked up on the first ring, her voice frantic with worry. "Ethan, I've been listening to the scanners all night. Are you okay? Is it true? About the sheriff?" "It's true, Maya. It's all coming out," I said, a profound sense of relief washing over me. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Scared. The whole town is buzzing. No one knows what to believe, but for the first time, the Blackwoods seem invincible. The silence feels broken." After the call, I found Jake standing by the burned-out wall of his workshop, staring at the damage. His life's work, his fortress, was a ruin. "I'm sorry, Jake," I said quietly. He turned to me, a slow, wry smile spreading across his soot-stained face. Sorry, don't be. For 30 years, I've been waiting for the monsters to show up at my door. They finally did. He kicked at a piece of charred timber. They weren't as tough as I thought they'd be. Guess I'll have to rebuild. Going to use thicker steel for the door this time. He wasn't a victim. He was a survivor. My conversation with Jake was cut short by the return of Captain Rostova. Her face was set, her eyes focused. Mr. Hayes, we're transporting you, Mr. Miller, and the evidence to our headquarters in Salem. You'll give a full, formal deposition. Thomas Blackwood may have run, but we have enough here to start dismantling his entire empire. His mother, however, is another story. Eleanor Blackwood, the matriarch. I had almost forgotten about her. We have troopers heading to the Blackwood estate now, Rostova continued. I'm placing a protective detail on you, as well as on Maya Lynn and Owen Garrison. We've cut off the muscle, but the Blackwood's influence runs deep in this town. It's like an infection. This, she said, gesturing to the flashing lights and the army of police officers, is just the beginning of the cure. The drive to Salem was a blur. Surrounded by the quiet professionalism of the state troopers, the wild, desperate fight for survival in the woods already felt like a scene from another man's life. I was taken to the Oregon State Police headquarters, a modern, sterile building of glass and steel that was the complete antithesis of Havenwood's rustic secrecy. They put me in a quiet, featureless debriefing room with a cup of coffee that tasted like heaven. There, for the better part of a day, I gave my formal, recorded deposition to Captain Rostova and a sharp, focused state prosecutor. I walked them through every detail, spreading the contents of my memory out on the table like evidence. The journal and the deed were now sealed in plastic bags, official exhibits in a case that spanned more than a century. The weight of the secret was finally off my shoulders, transferred to the methodical, implacable machinery of the law. For the first time, I felt like we might actually win. That feeling lasted until the lawyer showed up. He didn't represent Thomas Blackwood or Sheriff Brody. He introduced himself as Marcus Jennings, from one of Portland's most prestigious and feared law firms. He was impeccably dressed, his calm demeanor a suit of armor, and he stated for the record that he was there on behalf of his client, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. Captain Rostova allowed him to make a statement. Jennings stood, his hands clasped behind his back, and began a masterful performance. My client, Mrs. Blackwood, he began, his voice smooth as silk, is utterly devastated by the recent events that have disturbed the peace of Havenwood. She unequivocally condemns the violence that occurred at Mr. Miller's property and is shocked and deeply saddened by the alleged involvement of her son, Thomas. She has, and will continue to, cooperate fully with the state's investigation into these criminal matters. He paused, letting the implications sink in. He was already building a wall between Eleanor and her son. As for the historical allegations brought to light by Mr. Hayes, he continued, with a brief, dismissive nod in my direction, my client views them with the utmost seriousness. However, the journal in question is an uncorroborated, century-old document of dubious origin. It is the tragic but fanciful writing of a man who lost his property. While a historical curiosity, it is hardly a basis for criminal charges. He was attempting to dismantle our case piece by piece, not with denial, but with condescension. He was turning our smoking gun into a dusty museum piece. But Eleanor Blackwood's real move came a few hours later. Rostova came back into the room, her face tight with frustration. She turned on a small television. On the screen, a local news channel was playing a press statement. There, standing on the manicured lawn of her family estate, was Eleanor Blackwood. She looked every bit the grieving, dignified matriarch. Her voice was steady, her expression somber. She spoke of her family's long legacy in Havenwood, of her civic duty, and of her profound disappointment in her son, whose actions she claimed were a complete and shocking betrayal of their family's values. She was publicly disowning him, sacrificing her own son to the wolves to save herself. Then came the masterstroke. The historical grievances of the past must be met with the compassion of the present, she said, looking directly into the camera. In light of these disturbing, albeit unproven, allegations, Blackwood Industries is immediately establishing the Havenwood Reconciliation Fund. We will set aside a significant sum to financially compensate the descendants of any families who may have been unjustly displaced during the town's difficult founding years. It is time to heal old wounds, not reopen them with baseless accusations. I stared at the screen in stunned disbelief. She was a genius. A cold, calculating sociopath, but a genius. She was trying to buy her way out of a century of murder and conspiracy. She was transforming the entire affair from a criminal enterprise into a public relations issue, a historical wrong that could be righted with a charitable donation. She was controlling the narrative, painting herself as the town's healer, not its oppressor. "This is what real power looks like," Rostova said, switching the TV off. "We've got Thomas for attempted murder and arson. We've got Brody for the same, plus corruption. But her, she's insulated. She'll claim her son was a rogue actor, that she knew nothing. This journal," she said, tapping the evidence bag, "is powerful, but a good lawyer can drown it in reasonable doubt. Proving in a courtroom that she was part of a criminal conspiracy that killed Alistair Finch based on this, it's going to be tough." A feeling of cold dread settled in my stomach. We had won the battle at the workshop, but we were in danger of losing the war. Eleanor was going to get away with it. She would let her son take the fall, pay off the town's conscience with her reconciliation fund, and the core of the conspiracy would remain intact, untouchable. Then, a thought struck me. An image of Alistair Finch, sitting at his desk, surrounded by books. "Alistair," I said, thinking out loud. "He was a meticulous researcher. He wouldn't have staked everything on one old journal. He would have been looking for corroboration. Something to connect the original crime directly to the modern Blackwoods. To Eleanor." Rostova looked at me, her interest piqued. "We've been so focused on the garrison box, on what Alistair found," I continued, the idea solidifying in my mind. "We need to focus on what he was doing. His research logs, his computer, his recent library checkouts. The final piece of evidence, the one that ties Eleanor directly to this, might not have been on that mountain. It might still be sitting on his desk, right back in the Havenwood archive, hiding in plain sight." The journey back to Havenwood was surreal. I was no longer a fugitive hiding in the shadows, but a key witness sitting in the passenger seat of an unmarked state police vehicle, with Captain Rostova at the wheel and another trooper behind us. We drove past the town limits, and I could feel the eyes of the residents on us from behind their curtains and storefront windows. The silence of the town was different now. It was no longer heavy and secretive. It was brittle, fragile, poised to shatter. We didn't stop until we reached the public library. The yellow tape that had once cordoned off the archive was gone, replaced by a new, official state police seal. Rostova broke it herself and pushed the door open. "This is now an active crime scene, related to the homicide of Alistair Finch," she announced to the team of forensic investigators who followed us in. "We are looking for anything that connects his research to Eleanor Blackwood. Take it apart piece by piece." Stepping back into the archive felt like visiting a ghost. The room was just as it had been left after Brody's sham investigation, a time capsule of a good man's last moments. The air was stale, and dust motes danced in the beams of the investigators' flashlights. While the forensics team began their methodical work, bagging Alistair's notes and imaging his computer's hard drive, I stood by the desk, trying to see the room through the historian's eyes. What was he looking at right before he died? Hours passed. The initial search yielded predictable results: countless files on Havenwood's founding, detailed notes on the 5 families, and web history showing his research into the garrison lineage. There were even draft emails to university professors, asking for opinions on the journal's authenticity. But there was nothing that formed a direct, prosecutable link to Eleanor. It was all historical, all circumstantial. The frustration in the room was palpable. "Maybe he hid his most recent findings," a young detective suggested. "A hidden file, a safe deposit box." "It's not his style," I said, thinking of the gentle, academic man. "Alistair wouldn't hide things. He would document them. We're just not seeing it." I walked along his bookshelves, running my fingers over the spines of the old, leather-bound volumes. I thought about the first time I was in this room, about the feather on the page. Brody had been so quick to dismiss everything. What else had he missed? My eyes scanned the shelves, looking for anything out of place. And then I saw it. It was a minor detail, something only a librarian like Maya, or a meticulous historian like Alistair, would notice. A single book was misshelved. It was a thick, uninteresting-looking county ledger, but it was in the section for 19th century diaries, not with the other 20th century public records. I pulled it from the shelf. It was a dry volume, titled Havenwood County Land Transactions, 1970 to 1975. It seemed completely unrelated to the founding-era crimes. I was about to put it back when I noticed a thin, almost invisible indentation on the edge of a page, the kind left by a paperclip that has been in place for a long time. I opened the book to that page. It detailed the sale of the Caldwell property in 1974. The seller was the grieving widow of George Caldwell, the man who'd had the hunting accident. The buyer, as expected, was Blackwood Industries. I scanned the document, my eyes tracing the lines of legal jargon, and then my heart skipped a beat. At the bottom of the page were the signatures of the authorized agents. Representing Blackwood Industries was not the company president at the time, but a young executive who had just been granted power of attorney for the transaction. Her signature was elegant, sharp, and unmistakable, Eleanor Blackwood. This was the first piece. Eleanor wasn't just a passive inheritor of her family's empire. She was an active participant in its predatory expansion. "Captain," I called out, my voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." Rostova came over, and I showed her the signature. "This proves she handled the deal personally," Rostova noted. "It's suspicious, but it's not a crime." "But Alistair must have thought it was," I insisted, my eyes scanning the page for what he had seen. "What else is here?" I looked at the official stamps, the dates, the attestations. Then I saw a name Alistair had circled with a faint pencil mark, a name I recognized from the journal in the garrison box. The signature of the notary public who had witnessed and certified the deed. Beatrice Thorne. Elias Thorne's descendant. A Thorne had notarized the final, suspicious transfer of land from the last of the Caldwells to Eleanor Blackwood. This was the connection Alistair had found. It was the bridge between the original crime and the modern conspiracy. He wasn't just investigating a historical event, he was investigating the cover-up, and he had found a living link. "The Caldwell death," Rostova said, a sudden, fierce understanding in her eyes. She got on her radio. "Get me the case file on the death of George Caldwell, 1974. I want the name of the investigating officer and the signing coroner." The reply came back a minute later, confirming our worst fears. The coroner was Dr. Martin Harper. The investigating officer was Deputy Sheriff Michael Brody, Sheriff Brody's father. The entire system had been complicit. "Beatrice Thorne," I said. "She's the key. She witnessed the deal. She would have known the family history, the fear the Caldwells were under. She's the last living witness to Eleanor's methods." Captain Rostova was already on her phone, speaking with a crisp authority. "Get me a search running. I need to find a Beatrice Thorne, born between 1930 and 1950. She was a licensed notary in this county in the 70s. I need to know if she's still alive. And if she is," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious tone, "find out where she is. Now." The discovery in the archive lit a fire under the investigation. The case was no longer just about a historical crime. It was now a multi-generational criminal conspiracy with a living witness who could potentially connect all the dots. Captain Rostova's orders echoed through the state police network, and a massive digital manhunt for Beatrice Thorne began. For our own safety, Jake, Maya, and I were moved from the Salem headquarters to a secure, undisclosed location, a bland, comfortable suite in a government-leased hotel. Troopers were stationed in the hallway. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. The quiet was a relief, but it was also maddening. We were spectators now, waiting for news, completely removed from the action. Jake paced the length of the suite like a caged animal, complaining about the weakness of the coffee and expressing deep suspicion of the hotel's Wi-Fi. Maya, however, had convinced Rostova to give her a secure laptop with access to several research databases. While the state police searched official records, Maya began her own painstaking work, diving into the digital ghost of Havenwood's past, cross-referencing old newspaper articles, genealogical records, and archived social announcements. The first report from the official search team came late in the afternoon, and it was grim. Beatrice Thorne had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist in 1981. Her notary license expired and was never renewed. Her voter registration lapsed. Her driver's license was never updated. There was no credit history, no property ownership, and most ominously, no death certificate. She had simply vanished. "She's a ghost," Rostova's voice said over the secure speakerphone in our suite. Either she went completely off-grid, which was easier to do back then, or the Blackwoods made her disappear. A heavy silence fell over the room. The thought that we were decades too late, that Beatrice had been another victim of the Silent Crows, was a devastating blow. All our hopes were pinned on a woman who might have been dead for 40 years. "Wait," Maya said suddenly, her eyes wide, staring intently at her laptop screen. "I think I found something." We all gathered around her. She pointed to a scanned, grainy article from a 1981 issue of the Havenwood Chronicle. The page was dedicated to local social events. One of the items was a small, unassuming wedding announcement. "Beatrice Thorne," Maya read aloud, "daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Walter Thorne of Havenwood, was wed on Saturday to Mr. David Campbell of Astoria." Campbell. She had changed her name. "It's the only reason a woman like her would drop off the map so completely back then," Maya explained, her voice quick with excitement. "She got married, took her husband's last name, and moved out of the county. The official search was looking for the wrong person." It was a brilliant piece of detective work, the kind of deep-dive, human-level research that a computer algorithm would miss. I felt a surge of pride for the quiet, determined librarian who had become an indispensable part of this fight. Captain Rostova's voice came back on the line, sharp and re-energized. "Give me that name. Campbell." We could hear the furious clicking of a keyboard on her end. The silence stretched for a tense minute. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "We've got her," Rostova said, and the relief in her voice was palpable. Beatrice Campbell, age 81, widowed. Current address, a retirement community in Seaside, Oregon. On the coast. She was alive. The race was on. Rostova didn't trust the phone. She didn't know how far the Blackwoods' influence reached, how many private investigators their money could buy. Eleanor would have realized by now that the state had seized Alistair's research. She would know what they were looking for. She would be hunting for Beatrice, too. "We're going now," Rostova announced. "Hayes, you're with me. If she's going to talk to anyone, it will be the person who brought the truth to light." The journey to the coast was a high-speed, two-car convoy, a stark contrast to the slow, creeping dread of my time as a fugitive. We drove through the lush greenery of the Oregon Coast Range, the landscape a blur outside the window. All I could think about was the elderly woman we were racing to meet. Had she lived her life in fear? Did she have any idea that the secret she held was about to be dragged into the light? We arrived at the Seaview Meadows retirement community, just as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the peaceful, well-tended grounds. It was an oasis of tranquility, a world away from the dark forests and violent secrets of Havenwood. A nurse led us down a quiet, carpeted hallway to a room at the very end. The door was slightly ajar. "She likes to watch the sunset," the nurse whispered, before leaving us. Rostova and I exchanged a look, then entered. The room was simple, decorated with faded photographs and knitted blankets. Sitting in a comfortable armchair by a large window overlooking the Pacific Ocean was a small woman with neatly combed white hair. It was Beatrice. She didn't seem surprised to see us. She didn't even seem startled. She slowly turned her head from the window, and her eyes, though clouded with age, were incredibly sharp and lucid. They settled on me with an unnerving intensity. She held a small, leather-bound book in her lap. It was not the Thorn Journal. It was her own. "I wondered how long it would take," she said, her voice thin but steady as steel. "After all these years, you must be the one who found my ancestors' journal." She looked at me, a flicker of a long-dormant fire in her eyes. "Now, would you like to see mine?" The quiet room in the Seaview Meadows retirement community became a sanctuary of truth, a place where a 50-year-old secret could finally breathe. The setting sun painted the placid surface of the Pacific in hues of orange and gold, a peaceful backdrop for the storm that was about to be unleashed. Captain Rostova placed a small digital recorder on the table between us, its small red light blinking to life, officially beginning the most important interview of our lives. Beatrice Campbell, née Thorn, looked at the recorder without fear. She opened the small, simple journal in her lap. It was a standard notary logbook, its pages filled with neat, precise entries. "My family never forgot what happened," she began, her voice a soft but resonant alto. For others in Havenwood, the story of the fire and the 5 families became folklore. For the Thorns, it was history. My great-grandfather Elias's journal was passed down to me by my father, not as a story, but as a burden and a warning. He told me, "The Blackwoods and the Preston silence is not the silence of peace, but of a sleeping snake. Never, ever step on it." She paused, taking a slow sip of water. I spent my life trying to heed that warning. I became a notary because I believed in the law, in the power of a sworn, witnessed truth. I built a quiet life. And then, in 1974, the snake uncoiled right in my office. Her eyes took on a distant, haunted look, as if she were watching a memory play out on the wall. I knew George Caldwell. He was a good, honest man. He had started looking into his family's old papers, quietly asking questions about the original land grants. A month later, he was dead. The official story was a hunting accident. Everyone in town knew it was a lie, but we were all too scared to say so. Brody's father, the deputy back then, made sure of it. Then, she continued, her voice dropping, a week after the funeral, my office door opened. It was Eleanor Blackwood. She wasn't the old matriarch then, but a young, sharp woman in her 30s, already radiating a cold, ruthless power. With her was Martha Caldwell, George's widow. Martha looked broken. Her face was ashen, her eyes were empty, and her hands were trembling. Beatrice flipped a few pages in her logbook. Eleanor put the land transfer deed on my desk. It was all prepared. Martha was signing away the last of her family's heritage for a pittance. I remember asking Martha if she was sure this is what she wanted. Before she could answer, Eleanor leaned in and said, "Martha has a daughter to think of. A bright girl. It would be a shame if she didn't have a safe and prosperous future." It wasn't a question. It was a threat, as clear as a gunshot. I watched Martha Caldwell sign that paper, and it was the most cowardly and the bravest thing I have ever done. I was a coward because I stamped it. I notarized the lie. But I was brave because I documented it. She turned the logbook around and pushed it across the table. Her finger pointed to an entry dated October 12, 1974. It detailed the land transaction between Martha Caldwell and Blackwood Industries. And in the small section for comments, Beatrice had written, in her elegant, unwavering script, "Principal signer M. Caldwell appeared to be acting under extreme duress and emotional distress. Coercion by E. Blackwood is suspected." It was the smoking gun. A direct, legally recorded observation of felony witness intimidation, made by a sworn officer of the court, linking Eleanor Blackwood herself to the conspiracy's criminal methods. "After they left," Beatrice said, "I knew I couldn't stay in Havenwood. The warning started a week later. A dead crow on my porch. My tires slashed. Silent phone calls in the middle of the night. It was the crows. They were telling me to keep my mouth shut. I met my future husband that year, a fisherman from Astoria. He was my escape. I married him, changed my name, and I never, ever looked back. But I kept the journals. Both of them. I knew that one day, the truth might need a witness." Captain Rostova carefully took the notary logbook and placed it in an evidence bag. She looked at Beatrice with a profound, quiet respect. The old woman had carried this burden, this explosive truth, for half a century, waiting. With the deposition recorded and the final, irrefutable piece of evidence in her possession, Rostova stood up. The legal battle was over before it had even begun. She pulled out her phone. "I have a sworn deposition and corroborating, contemporaneous evidence directly implicating Eleanor Blackwood in felony conspiracy, intimidation, and accessory to wrongful death. I want a warrant for her immediate arrest. And notify the district attorney we are adding RICO charges to the entire indictment." A powerful sense of victory, pure and absolute, filled the room. The snake was finally cornered. The matriarch was going to fall. As Rostova was ending her call, I glanced out the window at the parking lot below. The peaceful sunset view was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek, black town car. It wasn't Thomas's SUV or Brody's cruiser. It was the polished, professional vehicle of money and power. A man in an expensive suit got out. Marcus Jennings, Eleanor's lawyer. Somehow, they had found her. Their network of spies and informants ran deeper than we could have possibly imagined. They were too late to stop the testimony, but they were here now to try and manage the fallout, to silence her the modern way, with legal threats and offers of money. "Captain," I said quietly, nodding toward the window. Rostova looked down, her expression hardening into granite. "They're too late." We heard footsteps approaching in the hallway, the brisk, confident steps of the lawyer, and the heavier tread of the troopers stationed outside moving to intercept him. The final battle for Havenwood wasn't going to be fought with fire and shotguns in a dark workshop, but right here, in the quiet, carpeted hallway of a retirement home on the Oregon coast. The quiet hallway of the Seaview Meadows retirement community became the final battlefield. Marcus Jennings, the picture of corporate poise, found his path blocked by two stone-faced state troopers. His calm, however, did not waver. "Officers," he said, his voice a smooth, modulated tool of his trade. "I am Marcus Jennings. My firm has been retained to represent the interests of Mrs. Beatrice Campbell. I must insist you let me see my client. You are harassing an elderly, vulnerable woman." It was a brilliant, audacious lie, an attempt to seize control of our witness, to get into the room and intimidate or buy her into silence. Captain Rostova stepped out of Beatrice's room, closing the door quietly behind her. She faced Jennings, her expression one of utter disdain. "That's quite a trick, Mr. Jennings," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Just a few hours ago, you were in Salem, telling me and the state prosecutor that you represented Eleanor Blackwood. You can't have it both ways." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the lawyer's face. He had underestimated how fast we were moving. "Mrs. Campbell has already provided a full, voluntary, and sworn deposition regarding events she witnessed in 1974, Rostova continued, pressing her advantage. "She has also provided her personal notary journal from that time as corroborating evidence. You are too late. You have no business here." Jennings's composure began to crack. "This is an outrageous violation of..." The only violation here, Counselor, Rostova cut in, her voice like flint, is the century-long criminal conspiracy your client, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, has been running. And as of 10 minutes ago, there is a warrant for her arrest. She held up her phone, an audio channel open. In fact, if you'll excuse me, I believe my team is arriving at her estate right now. Through the phone speaker, we could hear the faint, crackling transmission from the raid team in Havenwood. The sound was surreal, a live broadcast of justice being served. We heard a calm voice report. We are on the property. Approaching the main residence. No resistance. The scene played out in my mind's eye, the fleet of state police vehicles rolling up the long, winding driveway of the Blackwood mansion, a place that had stood for generations as an untouchable symbol of power. The lead officer's voice came over the radio again. We have made entry. Mrs. Blackwood is in the library. She is being informed she is under arrest. There was a pause. I could picture Eleanor Blackwood, surrounded by the leather-bound books and portraits of her criminal ancestors, a queen on a collapsing throne. I expected to hear shouting, denials. Instead, the officer reported back, his voice tinged with surprise. Suspect is in custody. She's coming quietly. Of course she was. Eleanor Blackwood would not give them the satisfaction of a struggle. Her final act would be one of cold, aristocratic defiance. Her silence now was not the silence of conspiracy, but of pure, unadulterated contempt. In the hallway, Marcus Jennings looked as if he'd been physically struck. His gambit had failed, his power had evaporated. He was just a man in a suit, miles from his client, rendered completely impotent. He turned, his face pale with fury and disbelief, and stalked back down the hall. The legal army had been defeated in a single, decisive skirmish. Rostova turned her attention back to Beatrice, who was now being escorted by two plainclothes officers. She was being moved to a secure facility where she would remain in protective custody as the state's star witness. The old woman looked at me as she passed, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, gentle smile on her face. The burden she had carried for 50 years was finally lifted. The matriarch was in custody. The truth was secured. But the fight wasn't completely over. Any word on Thomas? I asked Rostova. A private jet registered to a Blackwood Shell Corporation took off from a small airfield near Eugene about an hour before we arrested his mother, she said grimly. He's in the wind. International law enforcement has been alerted, but he has a lot of money and a lot of places to hide. He's a problem for another day. She was right. The immediate threat, the heart of the conspiracy, was dealt with. Thomas was the last, desperate remnant of a fallen empire. Later that day, I returned to Havenwood. I wasn't dropped at my secluded cabin but at the town square. The news was breaking. People were gathered in small, stunned groups, staring at their phones, watching the news on the TV in the window of the daily grind. I saw the image of Eleanor Blackwood, elegant even in handcuffs, being led from her mansion. The reaction of the townspeople was not joy or anger. It was a profound, collective shock. The unshakable foundation of their world had just been pulverized, and they didn't know what to do in the aftermath. I was no longer the suspicious outsider. As I walked across the square, people looked at me with a new, uncertain expression, a mix of awe and fear. I saw Maya and Jake waiting for me by the old clock tower. They had been released from protective custody, their part in the immediate danger now over. We stood together, the three of us, looking at the town we had broken open. The silence was finally, truly broken, replaced by the murmur of a community grappling with a terrifying new reality. The reign of the Silent Crows was over, but a new, uncertain dawn was just beginning for Havenwood. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed for the first time in what felt like a month. The quiet that greeted me was different. For 6 months, the silence of Havenwood had been a heavy blanket, a peaceful but oppressive weight. Now, it was a clean slate, a crisp, empty page waiting to be written on. The silence of secrets had been replaced by the silence of uncertainty, and it felt infinitely more hopeful. I drove into town, and the change was immediate. The people of Havenwood, who had perfected the art of looking away, were now looking right at me. As I walked into the daily grind, the conversations didn't stop, they shifted. People nodded in my direction, their expressions a complex mixture of gratitude, fear, and sheer disbelief. An old man I recognized from the lumberyard stopped me, his hand outstretched. Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My grandfather lost his farm to a Blackwood foreclosure in the 30s. We always knew something wasn't right. Thank you. But a moment later, a woman whose husband was a manager at the mill glared at me, her face tight with worry. You think you're a hero? She asked, her voice low and sharp. You just put half this town out of a job. She wasn't wrong. The Blackwood, Preston, and Harper assets, which comprised most of the town's economy, were now frozen by the state. The empire was collapsing, and the people who had lived in its shadow were now exposed and vulnerable. I hadn't just exposed a crime, I had broken a system, and the consequences were rippling through every life in the valley. Later that afternoon, I went to see Owen Garrison. I found him in his workshop, not working, but simply standing in a sunbeam, a look of profound peace on his face. The bitterness that had clung to him like sawdust was gone. "The state attorney's office called me this morning," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Eleanor's reconciliation fund has been seized and turned into a state-managed restitution fund. They're going to start the process of returning the stolen lands, or their value, to the descendants. My family's name is cleared, Ethan. After 100 years, it's finally cleared." He was a man unshackled from the weight of generations. Our next stop was Jake Miller's property. I went with Owen and Maya. We found him amidst the charred ruins of his workshop, grimly sorting through salvageable equipment. He tried to wave us off with his usual grumpy demeanor, but there was no real heat in it. We ignored him and started helping, clearing away debris, stacking salvageable wood. For the first time, Jake Miller, the town's most determined recluse, didn't seem to mind the company. His fortress had been breached, but in its place, a bridge to the community was slowly being built. Standing there, amidst the wreckage and the quiet camaraderie, Maya told me her news. "The county council held an emergency meeting," she said, her eyes shining with a purpose I recognized from Alistair. "They've appointed me as the interim town archivist and historian. They want me to fix the record. To create a new exhibit telling the real story of Havenwood." She was no longer just Alistair's protege, she was his successor, the new guardian of the town's memory. The call from Captain Rostova came that evening. "The case against the conspirators is ironclad," she said, her voice tired but satisfied. "Brody and the Harpers are cooperating in exchange for deals. They're giving up everything. The FBI has a lead on Thomas Blackwood. They think he's in the Cayman Islands. It's only a matter of time. The machine is working, Mr. Hayes. Justice is coming." She paused, then added, "You've become quite the celebrity. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they're all calling me, wanting an exclusive. The story is yours to tell, whenever you're ready." After the call, I sat on my porch, just as I had on that first, fateful morning. The silence was back, but I understood it now. Havenwood wasn't a place to escape the noise. It was a place where you had to learn to listen to what the silence was trying to say. My old life was calling to me, offering me a triumphant return, a front-page byline. I could go back to Chicago, back to the chaos I had fled. But as I looked out at the valley, I realized I hadn't just found a story here. I'd found a home, a purpose. I thought of Alistair, and Owen, and Beatrice, and the generations of people who had lived and died under the weight of a secret. Their story deserved more than a headline. It deserved a book. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going back to my old life. I was starting a new one. The conspiracy of the Silent Crows was over, but the story of Havenwood, the true story, was just beginning. And I was going to be the one to write it. The following autumn, a year after the siege, the silence of Havenwood had finally settled. It was not the heavy, fearful silence of the past, nor the brittle, uncertain silence of the immediate aftermath. It was a comfortable, earned quiet, the sound of a town at peace with its own truth. The changes were everywhere. The Blackwood Timber Mill, once a symbol of oligarchic control, was now the Havenwood Community Cooperative, bought out by its own workers with a combination of state loans and money from the restitution fund. The Preston and Harper names, once synonymous with power, were now just street signs, their family enterprises dismantled or sold to new owners. A new sheriff, a sharp professional from downstate, walked a beat in a town that was learning to trust the law again. The world had moved on, and so had the players. Eleanor Blackwood had died in federal prison of a stroke before her trial could begin, a quiet, ignominious end for a woman who had ruled for so long from the shadows. Her son, Thomas, remained a fugitive, a ghost haunting international watch lists, his vast fortune unable to buy him a moment's peace. Sheriff Brody was serving a 15-year sentence, his cooperation having exposed the rot that ran through the county's core. Beatrice Thorne Campbell, the brave notary who had held the final key, passed away peacefully in her sleep just 2 months after giving her deposition. She had lived long enough to see her family's truth vindicated and to know that her 50 years of silent waiting had not been in vain. On a crisp October evening, the entire town gathered at the newly renovated community hall. The occasion was the launch of my book. Its title was simple, The Silent Crows. The hall was filled with the faces of people I now knew not as suspects or sources, but as neighbors. I saw Owen Garrison, now a respected member of the new town council, his face free from the bitter lines of generational resentment. I saw Jake Miller, looking deeply uncomfortable in a clean shirt, standing next to a proud Maya Lin. His workshop was rebuilt, complete with a steel door twice as thick as the old one, and he now begrudgingly hosted a weekly tech club for local teenagers. Maya's exhibit at the library, Havenwood's True Founding, had become a permanent and popular installation. She had taken Alistair's legacy and given it a voice that could never be silenced again. I stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. I spoke not of crime and conspiracy, but of the quiet courage of people like Alistair Finch and Beatrice Thorne. I dedicated the book to them, the keepers of the unwritten history. A town is not just a place on a map, I said in closing. It's a story we agree to tell ourselves. For over a century, Havenwood was trapped in a story of fear and silence. Now, you are free to write a new one. Afterward, as I signed books, the people who had once eyed me with suspicion now shook my hand. They didn't just see the reporter who had broken the story, they saw the neighbor who had decided to stay. Later, I walked out of the bustling hall and into the cool night air of the town square. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky. I stood by the old clock tower, the heart of the town, and felt a profound sense of rightness. I had come to Havenwood seeking an escape from the noise of my old life, a quiet place to heal. I had found something far more valuable. I had found a home worth fighting for. A shadow passed overhead. I looked up to see a large raven gliding through the night sky. It let out a loud, clear, unapologetic caw that echoed across the square. It was just a bird. A noisy, natural, beautiful bird. The silence had been broken, filled not with chaos, but with truth. The crows of Havenwood were no longer silent, and neither was the town. And for the first time, neither was I. 5 years later, the autumn sun cast a long, gentle light across the Havenwood town square. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The town was still quiet, but it was a vibrant, living quiet, the hum of a community that was not just surviving but thriving. I stood on the steps of the newly expanded Havenwood Public Library, watching as the town gathered for a dedication ceremony. My book, The Silent Crows, had done more than I ever could have imagined. It had brought a measure of fame I never wanted, but it had also brought something else to Havenwood: resources, attention, and a steady stream of tourists who came not to gawk at a dark past, but to learn from it. "You're looking thoughtful," a voice beside me said. It was Maya Lin. She was no longer a timid librarian, but the confident and celebrated director of the Havenwood County Historical Society. The library and the town's history were her domain. "Just thinking about how much has changed," I said. "And how much has been built," she added, smiling. From the podium, the mayor of Havenwood began to speak. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with a quiet dignity that had long since replaced the bitterness he once carried. Mayor Owen Garrison was a symbol of the new Havenwood, a town that had confronted its history and elected a leader whose name was synonymous with the truth. He was here today to dedicate the Alistair Finch Memorial Wing of the library. As he spoke, I saw Jake Miller in the crowd, leaning against an oak tree and trying to look bored. His workshop was a local landmark now, and his tech club had just sent its first student to a state university on an engineering scholarship. He was still a curmudgeon, but he was our curmudgeon. Owen finished his speech and invited me to say a few words. I spoke of Alistair's quiet courage, of Beatrice Thorne's steadfastness, and of how a town's real history is written not by the powerful, but by the persistent. Afterward, we all filed into the new wing. It was a beautiful, light-filled space. In the center, under glass, were the artifacts of our story: Elias Thorne's fragile, handwritten journal, Beatrice Campbell's notary log, open to the fateful page, a first edition of my book, and Sheriff Brody's tarnished badge, returned by the state. On the wall above it all was a large, warm portrait of Alistair Finch, smiling his gentle, knowing smile. As I was standing there, my phone buzzed with a news alert from an international wire service. I opened it and read the headline: Fugitive financier Thomas Blackwood apprehended in Argentina. After years on the run, the last ghost of the conspiracy had finally been captured. It was over. Every last piece of it. Later that evening, the four of us, me, Maya, Owen, and Jake, sat outside the daily grind, sharing a quiet coffee as the last of the light faded from the sky. We were the unlikely architects of this new era: a reporter, a librarian, a woodworker, and a recluse who had, against all odds, helped a town find its voice. "You know," Jake grumbled into his cup, "for a town that's supposed to be peaceful, it's gotten awful busy." We all laughed. He was right. The silence of Havenwood was gone, replaced by the sounds of life, of debate in the town hall, of children playing in the square, of a community confidently writing its next chapter. I had come here seeking refuge from a world of noise and found myself in a battle against a world of silence. In the end, I had found what I was looking for, but it wasn't the escape I'd expected. It was a home.